Do I need to speak into this?
Does he need to speak in that?
I mean, if I speak like this, is it loud enough? Everybody can hear? Okay, because I'm going to choke myself on that. I may need a little bit of help here. I'm not sure I'm doing the right thing.
Regarding what?
Okay, great. And then we have, how does this work?
Disconnected?
I don't know. Is it? Okay, that's the pointer and the back and forth.
Got it. I guess you have to connect with Bluetooth.
Okay, it works. It works. Great. Great. Thank you. Much of the work I do, probably most of the work I do, is in industrial organizational psychology, which is very different from what Michael Hazen does. That's fundamental research. This is applied research. So this talk is going to be about applied psychology, specifically about the link between personality and well-being, especially in organizational context. So if you study this in organizational context, a very specific stream of research relates to well-being and stress. It is called occupational health psychology, and it's quite a quite new domain. Used to be, it maybe appeared in the 70s or 80s, very much focused on stress, and that was the word of the day at that time, you know, stress in the workplace, and influenced so much by positive psychology, we don't speak about stress anymore. We speak about well-being, speak about focus. No, so it's a positive outlook on it. But basically, what I'm going to speak about is stress, or of course, well-being, psychological well-being. So no stress in the workplace. Great. So just a few slides about the fundamental research we've had during the past 2 decades, I would say, that shows that, you know, it shows something that we all knew in some way or another, but it proves this. Stress is bad. We know that stress is bad. It's bad. But in specifically, what manner is it bad? We know now that, and we have very, very serious research evidence that stress is linked with psychological ill-being and linked with individual events and organizational events. So basically, what I'm trying to show here is that stress is bad for the human being, for the individual, and it's bad for the organization. And this is an important statement that you usually do as an applied psychologist. You usually, as an applied psychologist, you apply psychological knowledge by serving individuals and organizations. So you have to convince your prospective clients that you need to serve them. Yeah? So basically, when you go into an organization, you need to convince the manager of that organization that stress is bad. Stress is not good. Stress is bad. It's bad for all the people who are stressed, so for the individuals, and it's also bad for the organization in the end. So what's the research evidence? Linking, first of all, in individual events, linking stress to minor illness, linking stress to major illness, and linking stress to body and brain changes, I would say, generally. Well, the evidence is quite striking. I'm not going to stay very much on it, and some of these photos have been shown. I'm sure you've seen them before and heard about them before. What I show here is this is the amygdala. The amygdala has a very strong role in the processing of memory and emotional reactions and emotional memory. And what we know now is that for people who are higher on stress, that means lower in psychological well-being, you have a much more responsive amygdala. So that means that they are much more prone to process events that they are confronted with in an emotional manner. Yeah, it's like looking at the world through a lens that is more emotional. So you're more stressed, you process in a more emotional way. Also, we know that for people who are higher on stress, so lower on psychological well-being, you have higher activation in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. That's somewhere here. that has a very, very strong role in the processing of fear and risk. It's involved in the processing of the fight or flight reaction. So basically, you could deduce from here is that people who are higher on stress or lower on psychological well-being will process events that they are in, stimuli they are confronted with, as being more risky and generating more fear than people who are lower on stress and higher on psychological well-being. We also know, and I could go on and go on like this. This is a very magnified photo of cytokine. A cytokine, this is interleukin 6. It's a signaling molecule that has a very strong high role in the immune system. Basically, what we know at this point of time is that for people who are more stress. So basically, what the research I took this picture from shows that is that if you compare the first quartile with the fourth quartile in people who were assessed on stress, so people who are in the upper 25% with the people who are on the lower 25%, those who are in the lower 25% on stress have 3 times as much interleukin 6. So their immune system would be, I would say, it's of course an oversimplification, but I would say, you could say this, their immune system is 3 times as strong as that of people who are more stressed. So basically, what I'm trying to show here is something that goes, from certain points of view, goes against the grain. The buzzword, the word of the day is that you can control stress. If you're strong enough, if you do your meditation, if you hug trees, if you so, and what I'm trying to show is that these are brain changes and body changes that are not controllable. I mean, you can't control them by, I think that I get my message across. These are not, these are physiological changes. So, also another research, this is a little bit older, so a lot, 15 years back, but it's still interesting. It quantified the number of minor illnesses, a simple cold, a simple flu, minor illnesses across a period of 2 years for people who are high on well-being, so this is low on stress and high on well-being, moderate and high on stress, low on well-being. How many minor illnesses did they report during 2 years? And this is quite striking. I mean, it's more than double for people who are high on stress. So basically, your immune system is lower, you report more illnesses. So it's quite convincing, I would say. I could go on, and what I have here from a very nice review paper is a number of ideas that link stress and low well-being to minor illness, major illness, I would say, and body and brain changes. We know that if you're high on psychological well-being, that means low on stress, you have less cardiovascular risk. You are prone to have a lower weight and waist-hip ratio, so you're in better shape, I would say. You are higher on the, you are lower on the diabetes marker. You have more good cholesterol, better neuroendocrine regulation, and so on and so forth. I could go on, and of course you have some, a better immune function. You sleep better. People who are in the first quartile, compared again with people who are in the last quartile, have almost double the time of REM sleep, of rapid eye movement sleep, and we know that's the period when your brain relaxes and accumulates energy and so on. Yeah, great. So this was just the gist of it. So basically what we know now, based on research during the past 2 or 3 decades, is that stress is bad. Psychological well-being is good. And we know now that it's associated with minor to average impact on the individual health. Great. We also know, and I'm not going to linger very much on this, we also know that stress is associated with problems for the organizations, not only for the individuals. And this is important when you try to convince a manager to pay for a stress audit, for example, or for a stress intervention. Sometimes in business you get a very cynical view about how responsible management is for the workforce. You know, okay, stress is bad for the employees, but employees come and go. Is it also bad for my organization? And unfortunately, I haven't seen during the past dozen of years or so new research in this matter. But I have cited here some papers that are, some of them are quite old. I would say, well, 15 years, 20 years. It's not the Ice Age, but still, they're not very recent. All these are very, very convincing studies. I mean, 60,000 UK employees in the Donald study. Here you have a sample of 8,000 separate business units from 36 companies measuring a number of indicators. So what we see is that a significant percent of the variance in employee productivity, so we don't speak about job performance here, we speak about an organizational level indicator, employee productivity. So almost a quarter of the variance in employee productivity comes from psychological well-being and from other indicators that are associated with psychological well-being and stress. So basically what we know at this point is that at least a quarter, probably up to 1/3 of the variance in important organizational outcomes, such as, you know, employee productivity, customer satisfaction, other organizational level indicators, I would say, are caused, because some of these studies have been longitudinal, are caused by stress, by low psychological well-being. Okay, so we would conclude at this moment that people who are lower in psychological well-being, that means more stressed, see ambiguous events more threatening, feel that unfavorable feedback is more hurtful, have more contentious interpersonal tactics at work, and generate more conflict because of this, are likely to live shorter lives, to be less healthy, to be sick more often, and so on. Great. So we know now that stress is bad. I would introduce a few other concepts here. I would like to introduce the idea of challenge versus threat pressures, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this further on. This is important in my next argument. Not all pressures, stressors, so to say, not all stresses are equally bad. Stress is bad, you would say. But this is a very legitimate question. Is all stress equally bad? Are all stressors equally bad? Where does psychological well-being come from? From lack of stressors? From lack of all stressors? And I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but the basic point of it is that some stressors, some pressures, are challenging. They require you to do something. Like, for example, workload. It requires you to work more. Or time pressure. It requires you to work faster. Of course, there's a level of workload that's impossible to cope with. Of course, there is such a level. But basically, workload is a challenge pressure. It challenges you to do more. And then you have threat pressures that actually keep you from doing your work, like role ambiguity, for example. Role ambiguity doesn't require you to do something or to do more. Role ambiguity requires you to do nothing. Yeah, so it's it stops you from doing something. Yeah. Okay, so keep this in mind. We have different kinds of pressure, and we could look at them as challenging you to do more or threatening you and keeping you from doing more. Then I would also say something about, you know, this is a term that was coined by Cary Cooper, Sir Cary, Mr. Stress Cooper, a British psychologist who has done a lot of work in this area, and he speaks about bounce back ability in a very, you know, loose manner. The idea behind this is that people are very elastic. It's like we're like a ball. You throw it in the wall and the ball bounces back, or maybe you leave it on the ground and you put pressure on it, and if you put pressure on it for a little while and you take your hand away, the ball comes back. So this is natural for a human being. After stress, you come back to the initial state, if stress hasn't been chronic. And this is the whole idea behind it. Chronic stress is more damaging than acute stress. And this is important in work settings, especially, because sometimes stress is absolutely unavoidable. You have that kind of a client, he requires on a very short deadline an important project, and then you have to stay awake 3 nights and, I don't know, work 20 hours a day. You know, it's an important project, and the whole company works, and it's natural somehow. This is stress that is not only unavoidable, it could be challenging. It's a great thing that you do. You're so into it. You're so engaged. You feel motivated, and this is not necessarily the stress that damages you. This is acute stress. It's not chronic. After that, you have a period in which you will work less, and then you recuperate. Yeah, but if you do this day by day, week by week, month by month, for 3 or 4 years, now that's damaging. Yeah? So that's a huge difference between chronic and acute stress, and what also between challenge and threat pressures. What we have here is this is very symmetric. Reality is not so symmetric, you know. Every single time I see something so symmetric, I'm skeptical all of a sudden. I'm not very good in PowerPoint. I should have made this, you know, after the peak moment, it falls down much faster. But basically what I'm trying to show here is that pressure is associated with performance. Obviously, you go to work and you have nothing to do, no tasks. You're here, no pressure, absolutely, no pressure whatsoever. And obviously you don't have performance, nothing is required from you. And then you get a little bit of pressure and you begin to do that work. So you get more performance, of course. So basically putting pressure on employees is not bad. Pressure is not bad. And I'm trying now to differentiate between stress and pressure. Pressure is not bad. Pressure comes with the territory. Any workplace has some pressure, you know, some pressure. So you put more pressure, you get more performance. You put more pressure, you get more performance. And this is something managers are very good at, you know, putting pressure on people. Now the question is, how much pressure can you put? Because there's a level where if you put more pressure, you not only don't you get more performance is going to fall down. Yeah? Usually we call these areas the switch off area. So you're switch off here. You're not really interested. You're not really doing important things. You're not interested in those things. You don't seem valued by the work that you do. You have here a feel-good zone, and you may argue against that being the feel-good zone. I'm going to argue for that being the feel-good zone. My point is that you could argue for the fact that this is the feel-good zone. I mean, if you don't have so much pressure, you feel good. Okay, and this is the stress out or burned out zone. If you have chronic pressure keeping you in that zone, that leads to burnout. So you need chronic pressure, not acute pressure, chronic pressure, long time pressure, keeping you in that zone in order to generate burnout. Okay, now the big question is here, why is this the feel-good zone, first of all? Why isn't this one the feel-good zone? And second, what are these limits? How are these limits? You know, can you measure if someone is in that limit or is over the limit or under the limit here? Can you measure that with a test maybe? And my point is, no, you can't measure it with a test because this is a very subjective thing. We call it resilience. It's a buzzword at this moment, resilience. This is a very, very subjective difference. So it comes from within, I would say. It comes from it's an individual difference, and you can prove it. It's a very simple mind experiment, thought experiment, I would say. 2 people working the same job in the same department with the same boss from hell, with the same the same workload, and one of them goes to pieces and one of them continues. So obviously there's a difference between those 2 people. So there has to be an individual difference there at play. Yeah. So basically this is some people are more resilient. They can cope with stress and pressures for a longer time in a more efficient way, while others are not so resilient. So this is something that's this is where individual differences come into play, because pressure doesn't come from individual differences. And this is actually my major point. The major point of my presentation is that personality as an individual difference doesn't cause stress, doesn't cause well-being. The context causes well-being or stress. I mean, where does pressure come from? Pressure doesn't come from within. Pressure comes from outside, from the context, from the boss, from health, from the client that you hate, from the bad product that you have to sell, from the fact that the work environment, the work context doesn't give you control, doesn't give you, you know, so the context creates the pressure. You cope with it, and your own resilience, resilience is your own. Pressure is from the context. Your own resilience gets you in one or the other of the zones. Okay. Great. Now, a few things, and I'm going to explain why this is the feel-good zone in a minute. Let's focus now a little bit on hindrance and challenge pressures. So challenge pressures are challenging, hindrance pressures are threatening. These are a few examples. You know, workload requires you to do more. Time pressure requires you to work faster. Job scope requires you to think out, you know, more strategically. Responsibility requires you to take responsibility for other people's work, and so on. These can be stressful. They are pressures. At the same time, they can be challenging. They ask you to do more. And then you can have job insecurity. Maybe you don't have your job tomorrow. Maybe you're going to be laid off. What are you going to do? Well, be prudent and do nothing. If you don't work, you can't have any failures. And yeah, bad relationships with your boss, with your colleagues. It keeps you from doing stuff. It doesn't help you in doing stuff. It keeps you away from getting involved and engaged in your work, and so on. So these are hindrance pressures. And now, if you look at the relation between these pressures and strain, you get, by the way, these are correlations. You get a very low correlation of, you know, these are correlations, and if you look at the effect size, this means 4%. So the squared of the correlation, the R squared, 4% and 25%. So it's not just double, it's a lot more. It's 10 times as much. Yeah. So hindrance pressure are, you get high correlations with threat, while as challenge pressures, okay, they are stressful in a way, but not exactly stressful. And this is from a good paper of Sakov in the Journal of Applied Psychology, showing hindrance pressures and challenge pressures, how he associate this with 21 indicators. These are only the first 5, and look what research shows. Hindrance pressures associated with job satisfaction in a very strong negative way. So you could say that hindrance pressures generate low job satisfaction. So, and there's causality involved there, and very significant, while challenge pressures generate positive satisfaction. Not a strong relationship, but it is positive. So the relationship of hindrance pressures and the relationship of challenge pressures are very different with strain and with a number of important organizational outcomes. So what would be the conclusion here? Not all stress is equally bad. Some stress actually is not bad. So challenge pressures in a very unexpected way, although they are pressures, although you could consider them stressors, and they are actually subjectively labeled as stressors by people who feel those pressures, are actually associated with positive outcomes, if you wish, or are not associated with the negative outcomes you would expect. Yeah. Okay, well, why is that? Well, because psychological well-being is not so much associated with hedonism, but with something that's called eudaimonic motivation. Eudaimonic, coming from Socrates' daimon, if you wish, the devil with a fork inside of you, asking you to do things that are relevant for you, that are relevant for other people, to contribute to society, to do things that are worthwhile for yourself and valuable for yourselves and for others. So basically, lack of pressure gets you hedonic. You feel good. It's hedonic motivation. But this doesn't necessarily mean psychological well-being. Psychological well-being, especially in the workplace, is associated also with meaningful work, with job performance. Do you actually want to not have job performance and just to feel good? When you go to work, you want to do something meaningful. You want to be performant. You want other people to look up at you and see you as being performant and the leader of others. And you know, so this is eudaimonic motivation. So basically, challenge pressures help you, motivate you, push you towards eudaimonic motivation, while as the simple lack of pressure gets you maybe to a hedonic, if you wish, state. Okay, so this explains in a way why, this explains from certain points of view why this is the feel-good zone. This is the zone where you are at peak performance, you are at maximum performance, you can really prove what you can do. You can. I hope this makes sense for you. Okay, so this is about stress and where does stress come from? Well, where does stress come from? Well, we know now it comes from the context, and not exactly from the whole context, but specifically from some of the pressures. Where does psychological well-being come from? Well, from lack of the bad pressures and from a presence, a reasonable presence of the good pressures, if you want me to oversimplify. The dominant model in this regard is the job demand job resource model. This model uses other labels, if you wish. It doesn't speak about challenge pressures and hindrance pressures. It speaks about job demands and job resources. It's virtually the same thing. These are the challenge pressures, yeah, the resources, and these are the threat pressures, the demands. But basically what the model says is something like this. When you have high demands, threat pressures, high demands, you can cope with those demands if you have also good pressures, resources. For example, you have job overload, but if you have good social support those are resources. The job allows you to get support from your colleagues. You don't have the boss from hell. You have the boss from heaven. Speaking with you, patting you on the head. You know, you have an emotionally intelligent manager, if you wish. So anyway, you have a good relationship with your manager and with your colleagues, and you get social support. You can cope better with the overload. If you have job control over your job, that could mean control over the timing. You can decide when to do your job. Over the process, you can decide how you do your job. And so on. If you have some control, maybe you can cope with the overload. Or with some of the overload. So you get my point. You have the different kinds of pressure interact. It's not so much the presence or absence of a pressure, it's much more about the balance of those pressures. If the pressures are imbalanced towards job demands, then demands are too high, you cannot cope with them, you don't get enough resources to cope with them, that leads to burnout. So prolonged stress, chronic stress over a long time period, that deforms you, don't bounce back, it gives you, okay. If the balance is unbalanced, you have more resources than demands, then you can cope with all of them, and you can create that environment that you feel good in, you can have performance, and that leads to engagement. Okay, so this is, of course, the model is a little bit more complicated. You have a feedback loop that's called job crafting and so on and so forth. So this is how stress is generated. Well, where does personality come in? Because my talk should have been about personality and stress, and yeah. But my point here is that where do individual differences come in? Because stress is not generated by personality, and this is actually one of my main goals to underline the fact that personality is not a generative factor in stress. The context is all these are job characteristics. All these come from the context. The only place I spoke about personality is where I spoke about resilience. And actually you have that in the job demands, job resource model. They also accept something that's called personal resources. So basically you cope with the job demands through the job resources, so resources coming from the context, but also through personal resources, your own individual resources, and you also bring those into play. Personality is one of those. Personality traits are can be defined, are not necessarily, but can be defined, and usually are defined in my domain as behavioral preferences. You prefer cross-contextually to behave in a certain way and not in the other way. And that can be, it can be a resource. It can help you to cope with a stressful situation, with a stressor. But in what specific way? And this is also something that Michael has insisted on, not so much as I do now, I do it much more explicitly. I would say, what is the mechanism? What is the mechanism for it? Knowing why it happens and how it happens helps you to understand the phenomenon, and this is something that we lose. I mean, I read somewhere that the average child of 4 years asks 80 times a day the question why. Why? You know how children are. Why? And then they lose this curiosity, and researchers hopefully keep this curiosity and tend to question, you know, why does it happen? How does it happen? Why does it happen? And the major, I mean, the explanation at this point of time seems to be there is some evidence, not consistent evidence, not overwhelming evidence, but seems to be that personality has a role based on this model. The diathesis is just a fancy word for vulnerability. So the vulnerability stress model, if you wish. So basically, it explains the effect based on a moderation effect. So basically, what it says is that having a certain personality trait makes you more vulnerable, less able to cope with, and having the reverse makes you more protected, more, I don't know, puts you in the position to better cope with the pressure. And this is, of course, if you plot this effect, you know, it's differential prediction. You have basically you have different slopes of the effects that you get for introverts and extroverts, or neurotics and emotionally stable. What I have here is, you know, health complaints and job insecurity, and I don't show you the actual charts, but basically, if you you'll get a relationship between job insecurity and health complaints. The higher job insecurity, the more health complaints, but you get different slopes for people who are higher neurotices and lower neurotices. So basically the mechanism is a moderation mechanism. It explains how personality specifically influences the link between the context, the stressors, and well-being. Great. Now the big question is here, again, how? Specifically how? I mean, I understand now the basic mechanism, but how specifically does neuroticism influence this link? And there are a few explanations for this. First of all, neuroticism is basically understood as a broadband risk factor for mental health problems, overarching risk factor for mental health problems. It is associated with increased negative emotions, various forms of psychopathology. It is associated with unfounded somatic symptoms and with real physical health problems. So yes, neuroticism is much more associated with high neuroticism, much more associated with mental health complaints, physical health complaints, and so on. And the behavioral mechanism for neuroticism could be explained and seems to be explained at this point of time. There are a few other explanations I didn't include here, based on the fact that people who are high on neuroticism have a higher risk for negative life events. They experience more stressful events. They have less well-regulated emotional responses to such events, less efficient coping mechanisms, less social support, although this is much more associated with extroversion, introversion. And you have also neurophysiological mechanisms like, you know, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal reactivity, and immune response is also different, and so on. So basically, we know, we would predict that higher neuroticism makes you less resilient. Lower neuroticism, that means more emotionally stable people, have more resilience. So how is neuroticism as a big five trait associated with well-being? Well, I would expect, first of all, again, let me repeat, personality neuroticism, among other personality traits, is not generative for well-being. But in the context of well-being, I would expect more neurotic people to have less well-being and be more stressed. Why? Because it's a vulnerability effect. They are more vulnerable to the various stressful events that they encounter, and in the workplace, especially more vulnerable, less protected against job stress and job demands, yeah? Threat pressures. Extraversion. I've started with neuroticism. It's obviously the most research in this context. Extraversion is the second most research in this context. The mechanism proposed to explain the link between extraversion and health is based both on the social aspects associated with extraversion and on the positive emotions. So basically, when you look at the facets of extraversion, you get a number of, at least two kinds of facets. You get a facet that speaks about positive emotions and warmth, fuzzy feelings. You know, extroverts they feel more positive, they are more prone to feel positive emotions. So positive emotionality obviously is linked to well-being. Well-being is about positive emotions. So extroverts should be, I would argue for that, should be more prone to have higher, to have high well-being. Also, you have a lot of behavioral predictions that you can make out of extraversion. Comparing the upper quartile with the lower quartile of extroverts, you get 3 times as many friends. So basically, you have extroverts, the high extroverts compared with the high introverts, have 3 times as many friends. So this means more social support. You have more friends to support you. So a wider network, more social support, and they have those behavioral preferences that they actually ask for social support. I mean, not only do you have more friends, you're more prone to ask for social support when you need it. What happens with some of you are maybe extroverts, and if you encounter a negative life experience, when you meet your friends, you're going to, hey, let me tell you what happened to me. So what do you say? You actually say, okay, give me your support. So you ask for support in an active manner. So this is typical for extroverts. So I would argue for the fact that people high on extraversion are more protective. So are more prone to feel well-being and be less stressed. So have higher well-being. Again, I hope I didn't phrase this in a causal manner. There is no causality involved there. It's not a generative factor. It's, yeah, okay. Openness to experience, much more complicated to assess if openness to experience is, or to predict if openness to experience is in any way associated with stress and well-being. There are 2 conflicting mechanisms that you could bring into play here. One would say that openness to experience is more associated with physical and mental health complaints. So it would be a vulnerability factor because high openness is associated with a preference for involvement in varied experiences, among others sensation-seeking and risky behavior. Sometimes openness to experience is also associated with promiscuous behavior, abuse of substances, and so on. Activities that include danger and risks, like extreme sports and substance abuse, illegal activities. So based on this link, I would predict that openness is much more associated with physical and mental health complaints. On the other hand, and there is empirical evidence for this, but there's also empirical evidence for the other prediction. So I would say inconclusive at this point of time. In my own opinion, I would rather tend towards the second explanation, focusing on the positive outcomes of the proactive seeking of meaningful experiences that is typical for people high on openness. People high on openness, don't forget that in the Big Five model, openness to experience has been for a long time called intellectance. So it's a general intellectual factor, and people high on openness, they don't tend to be more intelligent, but they tend to have more diverse interests, to be better in seeking out those interests, to following their interests, and in the workplace, what they usually do, they proactively seek experiences that are meaningful for them. And this will tap directly into that eudaimonic motivation that I spoke before. So I would rather tend to say, you know, we don't have conclusive evidence. I would rather tend to say that openness to experiences is a protective factor, although not a very strong one. Agreeableness, well, this is pretty clear, I would say. Agreeableness is associated with well-being. Low agreeableness, that means hostility, basically, is associated with low well-being because of higher anger and hostility. That in turn are predictive of negative health outcomes, lower social support. If you fight with everyone and are conflictual, you have lower social support, and so on. Finally, conscientiousness seems to be again inconclusive evidence. In one of my papers, I've shown that it actually is right the other way around with a very strong effect. But seems to be, at least from theoretical point of view, seems to be protective factor because of probably the impulse control and planning capacity that is associated with conscientiousness. Conscientious people tend to deliberate, tend to plan. They don't throw themselves head first in risky situations, and this should have a protective effect. Okay. And I'm going to finish with this. So what we know at this point of time, and this was, if you don't carry anything with you, at least carry this with you. Personality is not a causal factor for well-being. It is involved in well-being. It has a strong effect as a moderator, as a vulnerability or protective factor. Stress doesn't come from personality, but personality can protect you in coping with that stress. Can you make you less vulnerable, or can make you vulnerable? Stress, however, the causal stream comes from the context, not from the person. And this has a bearing on how you do interventions. Just a few words about the interventions. You have, of course, this is a very medical model, if you wish. This is how doctors speak about interventions. You have primary level, secondary level, and tertiary level interventions. A tertiary level intervention in burnout, for example, or a prolonged stress would be a therapeutical intervention. So a psychotherapist comes in, you have burnout, you get, I don't know, get CBT or whatever treatment, you treat the problem. Treatment and rehab is tertiary intervention. You get back to work, you have, what do you get back at work when you get back? Yeah, well, the same browse from hell, the same stupid client, the same, so basically you're going to go immediately back to burnout because you're the same person, you don't have better coping mechanisms. And okay, anyway, tertiary intervention could function for the short time, not necessary for the long time. Secondary level intervention, that builds individual resilience. So it's different from treating the symptom. You build individual resilience. I don't know how many of you have been today at the conference, but you build better control. You build, so you make people more resilient by making them less neurotic, for example. And arguably, I don't know how much you could argue for that, because the personality trait is, relatively stable. It has a very strong genetic component. So in some way, to a certain extent, you can change it, but not majorly. Yeah, okay. Anyway, secondary level interventions build resilience, coping mechanisms, personality traits, and so on. Then you have primary level interventions looking at the sources of pressure. So you would look here at the balance between demands and resources. But I hope this is also going to open your mind up a little bit, because what happens usually when you ask people, what are you going to do to lower stress? People are going to say, I'm going to lower stressors. And if you go to a manager and explain that you're going to lower stressors, he's going to be very concerned, because those stressors are part of the job. I mean, are you going to make people to work less? I want them to work more, not less. This is the client. He has to be served. I know he's not the, I know, maybe he's very conflictual, but he has to be served, and that's a source of stress, and I can't get that source of stress out of the job. It comes with the job. What will you do? You can't get stress out of the job. So maybe you will look at giving also people resources, so you would have a primary intervention where you don't get stress out of the job, but you also get more resources into the job. Or you could have a secondary level intervention where you build more resilience. It's, okay, the job is lousy, the clients are lousy, the products are lousy, but at least I can make you more resilient. so that you're not in that area where you need a tertiary intervention. So I hope this makes sense for you. So just let me repeat: personality is not a generative factor. It interacts as a moderator, connected to the concept of resilience. This has an important impact on the way you plan and monitor interventions related to stress, because this means that you can address secondary level interventions, and psychologists rarely do this. Psychologists usually do this or this, and most psychologists actually focus on this. My point is that it's probably better to focus on second level interventions, working with personality traits as potentially protective factors. Great. Thank you very much.